Well, hello everybody, I'm Gary from Lantana Removal, Queensland. It's about the 10th of September 2018. Thanks for joining us today. Now basically I've got a lot of different things to get through with you with different parts of the Lantana. There's been a lot of things happening. It's getting very serious with the government now. Basically I've contacted the RSPCA because basically we've gone from here out through that Dundas out to Toowoomba and quoted a job out there, and I'm going through that place that I filmed all that stuff at the roadside with the drone side footage, bottom of Mount Glorious and something else I called it. Basically that material has been untouched for years and years and years. The gates at the bottom of the mountain there of Mount Glorious actually look like to me have national parks logos on them, but the land there along that section and other sections has waterboard as well, so I'm not sure 100% who owns that land completely. But anyway, I shot those videos there, you know, back in the beginning of the year, and it was fairly critical of the government there. Now there was nothing happening in those lands. They were completely abandoned. There's houses there that have looked to be resumed, that when we went past 5 months ago, you know, the Lantana was just say as tall as I am or less. These are houses on 6-8 foot stumps, and then a high ceiling house, so it's a fair height. You can't see the houses anymore. That's how much that Lantana has increased and covered those things. It's just completely engulfed that environment. Now we went out to quote that job, so we went and quoted the one at Dundas before that, which was about 2 weeks earlier, and I filmed that material again, and then suddenly found that they had gone and gotten a heap of scrub cattle. I mean, these were healthy, but they were rugged looking bulls and cattle, quite an extensive herd, and they'd been released into that area and they were eating the Lantana. Now in that terrain, the Lantana makes up probably about 60% to 80% of the forage in that area. Okay, so it's the most available forage. Now we all know that when cattle eat Lantana, they die, and they die the most horrific, agonizing death as they poison their liver and kidneys and everything else, and the autopsies are terribly unpleasant videos. And anybody who's ever seen an animal with that type of affliction never wants to see another one again. But anyway, so these cattle have been released into this environment. Now, they were eating it at that point, and I was fairly distressed, but I don't feel at some stage that there's a lot I can do about a lot of things. So, well, it bothered me. I went back, came home. 2 weeks later, we went out and quoted the Toowoomba job, and these cattle have been eaten like mad, this material. They're predominantly eating the Lantana. And the question I have for you is, are they owned by the national parks? Are they owned by the water board? Or are they owned by a private cattle person? Like, you don't have, I would guess easily on what I've seen, 30 plus head of cattle, maybe 50. It's very hard to tell because the terrain is so steep. That's another reason why you go and get scrub cattle. You don't go and get prize Chabrolets or whatever, you know, Angus bulls and stuff like that. You go and get really tough scrub cattle that will climb the hillsides and the areas that this material's in. Now, for me, you'd think those questions are pretty simple to answer. So I asked the RSPCA, thank you for contacting us with your concerns. RSPCA inspectors can only enforce the Animal Care and Protection Act of 2001, which does include the following offence. A person must not, with the intention of injuring or killing an animal, feed the animal a substance the person knows is harmful or poisonous to the animal. This knocked my socks off. However, there are a number of exemptions to that, some of which may be covered in the Biosecurity Act, with which RSPCA does not administer. For the best response to your specific query, we would recommend you contact the Department of Agriculture and Fisheries, who administer the Biosecurity Act, and their details are there. So I've sent that email with my concerns to the DAF to ask them about that, because this is really getting to be a very serious business, this stuff. I mean, this is as serious as a heart attack. You know, if the DAF or the national parks or the water board are owning cattle or putting cattle into that particular instance to try and cover up the level of infestations along those lands owned and occupied by the National Parks and Wildlife or by the water board, you would reckon that's criminal. It's criminal to me anyway. I have no problems about that. But do I think the government went and bought cattle? I wouldn't think they would. But let's say that they then, this land, from what I'd seen and what I'd filmed, hadn't been inhabited for a very long time. That there weren't any tracks from any animals through this material. Then these animals were brought in there. So did they then lease this land to somebody who brought cattle in there? And anybody who owns a herd of 30 or more cattle would have to know you wouldn't own that many cows, because they're not cheap. Like, I've got people in the cattle industry have said to me, on the price of what cattle are worth, anybody that would be foolish enough to put cattle into that, you can buy a lot of machine hire for that price that those cattle would be worth. That would be absolutely ludicrous, except that the terrain is so steep that four-wheel drive options of sacrificial cattle would maybe make a reasonable thing. But then you'd have to ask the question of who authorised putting the cattle in there. Surely national parks would have some responsibility in there where 60% to 80% of the terrain is Lantana. Their hands wouldn't be clean, that they would then have somebody approach them to lease the land and it's covered in it to that extent. You couldn't imagine how you could legally, as your obligation to protect the wildlife, allow those animals access into those areas unless you fenced off and stopped the cattle from getting at that material. But the cattle have actually been placed into that area and they are eating the hell out of it. From that 2 weeks between when we've been out and when we've gone out a second time, they'd been eating a lot of material. They are gonna die, there's no doubt about that, and it's a horrific death on the levels of material that's being eaten. There's nothing else to eat there. It's not like they have the choice of other plains that have got really good forage. It is predominantly only the Lantana, and at this time of year, it's known by every person in cattle that they will eat that stuff at this time of year predominantly. They will really go after it. Now, we've got to ask those questions. Now, the DAF hasn't got back to me. Like, I've sent them an untold, very clear email and asked that question, but I'm going to be very eager to hear what the Prime Minister says and what the Premier of Queensland and New South Wales say, because I don't believe this is a completely isolated incident. I've had people on Facebook come to me and say, oh yeah, we use goats, and I'm pretty certain from the conversations that were had that these people were actually people who breed goats, okay? Even all of these people know that goats will die from eating Lantana, okay? Goats will not eat Lantana by choice. You have to physically stake that animal to that bush and starve it of other foods so it has to eat that bush, and it will die. Now, I can't think of a much more criminal act than that. But when you push these people, right, they then turn around and go, oh yes, but you feed it molasses and there's a couple other ingredients that they say. You feed it this cocktail and it'll last a little bit longer. Okay, these conversations actually happen. They are actually real. And you go, but they still die, don't they? Oh yeah, no, they still die, but they last a little bit longer and they eat a little bit more Lantana. And I've always been bothered about these conversations, but out of the situation, they are nameless, faceless people. So you say, okay, so within this situation, what happens? Oh, you know, there's plenty more goats. You just go and buy more goats. Like, you know, when you listen to what's written there about your responsibilities, or that it's a very serious crime to knowingly have that goat die of that horrible disease, right? And then to feed it other materials to try and get it to live a little bit longer and eat more material. What's the morality of these people that are saying this to people? You know, goats die if they eat lantana. It's as simple as that. They will not willfully eat the lantana. You have to stake them to the bush to eat it. Every part of that should have somewhere where the RSPCA, if we can back this up with people, actually nail these people's feet to the floor and prosecute them for what they are. Now, I'll bet you these people saying this are people breeding goats. They were too well versed at saying, oh, there's plenty more goats, we've got plenty more goats, you know. There's no morality in it. You know, they should be force-fed the lantana and suffer the same fate if they think it's perfectly all right. But anyway, that's a little bit too out there left field. But I do feel that angry, that I feel like if you're that big a coward that you would inflict that sort of suffering on an animal like that, you deserve to have me jam lantana down your throat, you know, like, makes my blood boil they are actually real people. These are not, they don't have a face on their picture, but they are real people. So please don't listen to any of that rubbish about goats will eat lantana, because other people have come forward and said, I spent a lot of money on buying goats to get rid of the lantana and they won't eat it. These people were genuine people who were ripped off, you know. But there are also people who won't stake the goat to the lantana because that's morally wrong. Nobody explained that to them when they were purchasing the goats. Goats don't eat lantana. They don't eat it on purpose. If you force feed it to them, you're breaking the law. And if you know that they're going to die, and there's a pretty good chance if you're staking goats to lantana, you know that they're going to die. Okay, so anyway, I guess that's probably as much video of that subject as you want, but you want to check out the next video, which has to do with our interactions with the Brisbane City Council and the Moreton Bay Regional Council, and how illegal the activities of allowing lantana to grow on the roadsides actually is. See, each and every week that goes past, we get more and more information for the general public, and people become more aware of their rights. We have now got it to the stage where these people don't respond to us directly at this stage very quickly, but I've put the acid on the councillors because they were voted by the people to reflect the people's interests, and people have this much material being fed to their animals because the council is allowing it to grow in these places. And the council has lied all along. All the councils have. They've said, oh, we've got management plans in place, and there is nobody enforcing or overseeing those management plans. There's no management plan in place, I can tell you now. If there was, then these people have no ability or knowledge in lantana, and I am calling on that to become a what's her name? We need to be put in place over the top of the councils so the state and federal government can have an overseer that actually understands lantana. They can go to the councils and go, okay, show me where you've been working, and the councils have to provide you with the documentation of where they're working. And we should be going through and we should be highlighting areas that must be dealt with by priority, and then the councils must be dealing with those. Or else the state and the federal government back us to remove the material and bill the council for it. That's what should be happening. It may seem pretty radical to say this is what has to happen, but when you look at the growth rate of this material and you see what is actually happening with this material, this moral dilemma of feeding animals the material to get rid of the material is not the worst of the horrendous conduct by the governments, okay? The state and federal government put a lot of money and a lot of effort into trying to get some of this stuff done, and then every council across the eastern side of the country shafted every one of us and the state and federal government, and have knowingly done that. Now, how clean are the hands of the state government? You have to ask yourself the question. They should have been looking at this 20 years ago, because the councils have been doing it the whole way through. I believe what's happened is that the state governments realise that they've got no control over the corruption within the councils, no control over how massive this horrendous issue has gotten to. So they've gone, well, let's try and tidy it up by covering our tracks, and will say you can't clear it off any steep slopes because you'll do too much damage. You can't do it in this area because it'll cause too much damage. Instead of saying, you know what, we need to stand up because it's an Australian national biosecurity disgrace, and if we don't get into this war now, the billions of dollars it's going to cost in the next 12 months and the next 5 years is going to, we're going to trace this back to the point that we actually are pointing fingers at people who actually caused all of this to happen, and money's going to be wasted on chasing the blame game down that rubbish there to stuff that should never have happened. Quite frankly, there should have been policies in place that stop these things from actually happening to our children's future. 10 million hectares is a massive amount of material, but the growth rate on that's going to be 3 to 4 times that in the next 5 to 10 years. The escalation of this material, which I'll show you in the next video, will blow your mind as to exactly what we're facing as a nation. And that's one weed out of 32. Okay, so there's 31 other weeds are equally out of control, and they're doing no better job of any of them. And they're allowing the council to do that because they don't want to stand up to the council. They don't have any physical workforce that can do the work. So instead of them enforcing the law, right, and they know the law is being broken every single day, they prefer to turn a blind eye to it and try and run away from it. That's how weak our Prime Minister and our Premiers are. Both New South Wales and Queensland. They're all running away from this. Our Agricultural Minister, finally got the daft to answer me, but they're not liking what came back to them, because it's actually factually all of the ammunition that they had handed me for the Moreton Bay Regional Council and the Brisbane City Council and every other council across the nation. These guys have been getting away with breaking the law for close on 30 years, and nobody has done anything about it. They've been collecting the money for the weed section of our rates and everything else, and they've done nothing at all about it. If they had have gotten overwhelmed and the problem was too big for them and they didn't have any of the answers, they should have asked the questions of the people who can do the work. They should be putting people like myself in the front line that actually, I'm the only one that can physically do the work on the slopes, that this material must be cleaned off from first. The whole target acquisition program that they put in place to protect national assets is all screwed up. It's all completely arse about face. And it's not the people's fault. It's not the farmers' fault. It's not the landowners' fault. We're being infested from national parks, from state forests, from the water board, from council lands. These guys have all the Lantana. They would have 80% of the Lantana. And they're trying to make out that they're worried about the public infecting them at some level. Now that it's out of the bag of just how bad the water spreads this material, it's going to change the litigation side of this argument forever. And now you've got cattle being put into places where this material makes up 60 to 80% of the forage of that area. You have to start going, there is a very serious moral issue that none of these people have morality in, and we need to start paying attention to it, because those cattle aren't going to do anything but eat it and trample it down in the visible section of that land. There's thousands of acres of that land completely over that hillside that we won't ever see, right? And that's all these mobile tanks were brought in there for, is to do that, and they die, that's it. They don't require operation. Somebody doesn't have to drive them all the time. When they're dead, they're dead. But the horrible death they suffer, you have to have a look on the DAF site and see what Lantana poisoning in cattle looks like and other animals. It's horrendous. You will not enjoy it, and you want to be strong-stomached when you go and have a look, but you owe it to the animals. If you care about animals at all, and that's only the stock side of it. I'm telling you that our natural wildlife is eating this garbage too. I'm telling you that now. I've been into job sites, to quote those job sites, where I've seen the markings on this material, and it's a lot of our Australian animals low to the ground that are eating this material. They're not in the full blanket thickets. They're in the more open country, but they're eating it as well. So they'll be dying exactly the same death. But whether they got hit by a car because they were that blinded by the illness of the disease, I can't tell you, but it's a horrific end. But anyway, I'll leave that at that. Lantana Removal Queensland, 0449 986 880, on Facebook at Lantana Removal Queensland, and the same on the net at .com.au. So thank you very much for stopping in. I'm Gary, my son Joel. We are fighting this war ourselves. We're paying for everything ourselves to try and get a solution to this issue for the Australian public. We can't let this continue, because the infestations that they're allowing to grow in the places they're allowing it to grow is expanding at that big a rate that in very short time this whole ecology argument is going to change. And it's all been stacked against operationally these things being able to be done, and yet we've been doing it for 40 years. So, you know, there's no phone calls being made to arrange to get this program up and running and seriously get after this material. They give 440 million to the reef, but nothing to Lantana or the other noxious weeds. They give $750,000 gift to their mates in the council who don't even do the work anyway, to rewrite a book that I exposed, because all the data was 50 and 100-year-old data that they were using in the book, but it's completely wrong. So the same people have got $750,000 gift to rewrite the same material, right, with a modern spin on it. But we don't have a dollar to clean up this hundreds and hundreds of kilometres of this material. Like, it just does not make sense that Mark Ferner is so far removed from reality. Like, I know he isn't a person that knows anything about Lantana, I understand that. But the DAF, he gets the DAF to write me, and their understanding is no better. But the DAF says to keep on hounding the councils. The councils are operating illegally. They are willfully allowing this material to be released to the environment. That is against the law. It's against the law at your place, you know. Brisbane City Council have just handed another ratepayer documents to say that either they clean it up or they're going to be fined. And they told that ratepayer that it was noxious weed. Yet when they wrote to me, and I've got it in writing, they said, we don't even do anything with it anymore because it's low risk now and we've given up on it. Now, everywhere that they're allowing that material, all through the back of Mount Cootha, all through the state forest, the Brisbane City Council forest there, it's all illegal. And yet the council can just act illegally, and the state government has no cojones to go after them at all. Where does the whitewash and the cover-up end? Does the government do another backflip and they pass some quick legislation to tidy up that loophole and allow councils to then allow this material to grow anywhere? Do they allow for the councils, governments, or people to lease that land off them and stick cattle in there as sacrificial lambs? At what point do we grow a set and say, hey, listen, Anastasia, you need to sit down and think about your next move? I don't doubt that my pushing it this hard could not have them be that morally bereft that they go and change the laws to do that. There's places where the laws have been changed retrospectively to make sure that people can't be prosecuted that were illegally operating. You know, that's happened with quarrying companies, you know, and yet we don't seem to jail the politician who did that. We don't, the Anastasia Palaszczuk government doesn't redo that law and put that back and go, well, these guys have been willfully breaking this law for this long. They deserve to be prosecuted. I don't care if they're one of the biggest quarrying companies in the country. They're breaking the law and knowing they're breaking the law, or they don't care that we're telling them they can't do that. But this happens with this Lantana. The councils have been doing this everywhere, from Petrie right through to Sanford, through Debra through to Sanford, through up over Mount Mee to Woodford. You've got people constantly from Mount Mee and Woodford going, you want to see the cat's claw through here, you want to see the Lantana and cat's claw through here, and the cockspur, and you know, the list goes on and on and on, and the camphor laurel. And the council says, no, well, we've got a weeds program in place. There is no weeds program in place. But now they have some serious information there, and I've said to them, if they don't want the people actually coming after them legally, right, with damages and compensation claims, then they need to get after this, and they need to be working through a proper weeds eradication program. If you've got lantana growing, the only way to meet your obligation to stop it from spreading is to eradicate it. But they took that out of the law by changing the classification, okay? But legally, that material cannot be released in the environment. Now, if this government turns around and changes that law to release it to the environment, I need you guys to see the next video that has the actual growth rates on this material, and you tell me whether you feel that that's a satisfactory response with a cancer like this, because that should be how we judge what happens with this country and who leads it in the very near future. So I'm Gary, thanks again. I'm sorry I went over again, but this stuff needs to get to the people, and people need to be aware of exactly what's being done and to whom it's being done. Thank you very much. Check us out on Facebook. Please throw us a like. Please share the information around everywhere you can, because the importance of sharing the information makes all the difference in the world for people to be able to respond to it. You know, this costs a lot of money to get the word out, but I need more actively helping to spread the word and to discuss this, because it's morally incorrect. It's damaging everything, every part of our society. Thank you. I'm Gary. Bye bye.